Everyone, he said everyone will get a chance to testify. So they're going to try to make sure that everybody can get it.
So we should just hold on.
Yeah, just hold on to it whenever you come in, you can. Okay, does that work for everybody? And then as far as going in, like I said, we're kind of doing it on an honor system. But everyone will get in. Again, if the room's full, you just have to go and testify, turn around and go back out.
I didn't know.
External guys. No. Yeah.
I'm looking at it as, why are we usurping the vote of the people? And holistically, why are we saying that crime is the responsibility of the prosecutor wholly, and not the police department, not the state legislature, not all of us holistically, and the police, because they have a responsibility. Because as long as I've been in there, we've had a whole bunch of unsolved crimes that are just unsolved and been unsolved and on the books for decades.
Happy to answer that. The question of whether it's the state legislature's responsibility, absolutely, that's why I'm here. It is a part of our responsibility. I would argue that the police could do the best job in the world, but if the case is not filed and it's not prosecuted, it all becomes somewhat moot. It is ultimately the prosecutor's decision whether or not to file a case. And
Well, because I know during this last couple of weeks, some shenanigans has taken place. But I'm saying prior to that, prior to last week, any documentation as to, the number of cases and what those cases were that was presented to the prosecutor's office that everybody deems were not prosecuted.
The last time I was made aware of it, there were approximately 17 prosecutors who left in the circuit attorney's office. Of those, 5 do the most serious cases. Of those, 2 had more than 100 cases, and they're supposed to be prosecuting homicides in addition to handling 100 cases. That's impossible. It simply can't be done.
Well, are you aware that homicides have spiked since 2016 in St. Louis City because the legislature, when we passed the Stand Your Ground law, they went up?
Prior to 2016, the predecessor to the current circuit attorney filed approximately 8,000 cases. This circuit attorney last year filed 1,600.
And so it looks like to me that we're attacking the prosecutor that was elected by the people. See, what I see this part of the bill is as an attempt by the state, you get me, to attack a prosecutor who was overwhelmingly elected twice by the people. And that decision again comes up in August of 2024. And they're not, to me, it's not a requirement or responsibility of the state to put a supervisor over an elected official.
When you talk about the prosecutor who was elected twice, overwhelmingly, talk to the people who are left behind when their loved ones are dead to see if they feel the same way. Talk to the people who don't feel safe in their home and see if they feel the same way. Talk to those who've been robbed or assaulted and the people who commit those crimes are not being prosecuted. Ask them if they feel the same way that you do.
Well, I have those meetings every week in my community.
And do they tell you that they support this prosecutor?
They're not blaming it on the prosecutor, they're blaming it on the police.
Yep. And what do the police do when they file a case with the prosecutor and she doesn't file a case?
Well, that's where we have that again. I think there's a miscommunication or misnomer when we're saying when the police file a case to the prosecutor and the prosecutor is not filing the case. Because see, you have judges in there, because I've seen where the prosecutor have filed many cases and asked for extension for more investigation, so investigators can go out and get more information. And I've seen where the judge would not allow a continuance in a whole lot of those cases and force the prosecutor's office to drop those cases and have to refile. So I'm looking at this as a holistic assault. And you probably, I don't know if you were in the legislature when all of this happened, but it's a lot of stuff that has led up to this that the Missouri legislature is attacking this prosecutor specifically on. And it it goes back to the Governor Whiting situation. So if we're continuing, so I have to look at this deeply, trying to figure out, are we really trying to solve an issue, or are we really just attacking this prosecutor because we are offended, or we need to put her in her place because of the actions that she's taken us to.
What matters to me is that the people committing these offenses are not being prosecuted.
So let me put something else on the table. That's why I say why now, because these statistics were the same prior to her taking office. But let me just lay this on the table too. To me, we're in the city of St. Louis, which has always been a predominantly African American city since I've been, growing up. And we've always seen justice through the eyes of Caucasian people who has the idea that locking up, we went from slavery to incarceration, and that has not changed for African Americans. And so now Caucasian Americans, white Americans, are seeing justice through the eyes of an African American who has created a lot of criminal justice reform ever since she's been in office, which the voters wanted. So I don't know if I can compare those statistics and say, we have to look at those statistics through a different lens and not just numbers. But thank you anyway for your questions and your answers. I appreciate it.
Right, if I
Her suggestion and narrative would be that somehow it's pro-Second Amendment laws that have been passed by the General Assembly. She specifically mentioned SEPA, which was passed in 2022. Do you know the year where there was the highest on-record homicide rate in the city of St. Louis since 1970? What year that was?
I think it was back in the 90s, as I recall.
2021.
21.
2021. So the year before SEPA passed was the highest homicide rate since 1970 in the city of St. Louis. And would you care to guess, if you look from 1970 to present, for the 10 highest years of record crime in the city of St. Louis, how many of those years, 10 years of the highest homicide rate in St. Louis, were under the watch of the circuit attorney? Bear in mind, she's going back to 1970. She has been in office since 2017. How many years of the 10 years the highest homicide rates are on her watch?
I believe it's personnel.
It's 6. 6. So she's been in office 17, 18, 19. She's been in office for 6 years. 6 of the 10 highest homicide rates since 1970 coincide with the 6 years that she's been in office.
And it also
Now, I think, Senator, I think if we want to talk about causation, it's difficult to make a credible argument that the circuit attorney and her failure to prosecute cases, her conviction rate, which is 50%, which is one of the lowest conviction rates in the United States of America. I think there's only one prosecutor in the country, the prosecuting attorney in the city of Orlando, who has a more abysmal conviction rate than Ms. Gardner. And so the notion that somehow she is not partly responsible, I'm not saying that there aren't multiple factors causing crime in the city of St. Louis, but that she is not partly responsible, I think lacks credibility.
Since Ms. Gardner took office, the number of criminal cases dismissed by city prosecutors has steadily increased. Prior to her control, on average, about 10 to 15 felony cases were dismissed. Since Ms. Gardner's control, that average has jumped over 30% of all felony cases dismissed by prosecutors. In addition to that, the circuit attorney's office loses about half of all the cases it takes to trial. Before Ms. Gardner was in control of that office, that number was closer to about 30%. There's a massive backlog in the city's prosecution system. There's some dispute over the number of cases, but according to our data, as of January 1st of this year, there were over 4,000 outstanding cases. Those are defendants who have been released pending application of warrants. Those are individuals who are released free to roam the streets of St. Louis until the case has been reviewed. These cases don't just include nonviolent or victimless crimes. The numbers also include over 200 violent felonies.
And the city of St. Louis has been polarized ever since I've been there. And police officers have not been the friend to African American communities as long as I've been there. You get me? And so, and these relationships have always been challenged. And before Circuit Attorney Gardner took office, you had other prosecutors. And it amazes me how this legislature didn't step up when you had Jason Stockley. You got me, who the prosecutor arranged to go to California without even standing trial brought no charges against them. So, and then you have, doing the protests, when they assaulted their own officers and got away with it. The courts let them out. So, and I want to set the record straight because you weren't accurate when you said that Attorney Gardner was the one. The attorney representing the young man even put out a statement that in this case, her office did nothing wrong. He argued that his probation or parole be not revoked, and she argued that it should be, and the judge made the decision. So we want to make sure that we get the record correct in this instance. So we don't want to put false information out there and making this young lady like she was responsible for what happened to her. That's a big stretch. But when we're talking about dismissed cases, so when I was in the House, we had a conversation about St. Louis City, St. Louis County, all of the jails who were holding individuals for trial. And we had that they were being held more than 2 years prior to this even happening because Governor Greitens was concerned about that as well when he hired the new director of corrections. And we fixed the problem in budget, and it was a problem that we had back then. So, I just want to make sure that we have, but this is my one question for you. Because you mentioned, you're talking about cases not being tried and filed. Aren't witnesses not coming forward?
Well, that's certainly part of.
That's part of it. Mm-hmm. And what about insufficient evidence?
I'm sure there are cases of that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And when you said when Prosecuting Attorney Gardner took the office, I want to know, you talked about prosecutors fleeing the office. What are the demographics of those prosecutors that left the office?
I don't know that information.
Right. So, so the reason I say that is because, we have historical challenges in this state when it comes to race relations. You get me? And we got to fix it all because we got to have that come to Jesus moment for police, citizens, and all of that in order for us to fix this problem, because this problem is bigger than Kim Gardner. It's really bigger than her. But when African Americans become leaders, become the boss normally, you have white flight. It's just like in the communities. When we began to migrate in certain areas that African Americans weren't allowed, then we noticed white flight. They would leave those areas. And then, not only that, the leaders, and I'm holding all of them accountable, because they've had this conversation with me before. The leaders and the disinvestment in the areas that foster the crime. That's why Hayden created the Hayden Triangle. Those are the communities that have been least invested in the community. So the reason I'm having this conversation is because you're making it like it's one person when it's a holistic contributory factor in the reason those cases are the way they are. And you have to look at each one of them individually. And you can't compare to prior to her, because when you're looking at judges and their relationships to prosecutors, this is an issue in the city of St. Louis, because when she first got elected, it was an issue. A racial issue happening with judges when she got elected. And this is a fact. So I just want to say that all of this is contributory.
Good afternoon, thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Darrell Gray. This is a bill this is an expensive solution in search of a problem. Assuming that a special prosecutor is appointed and hires a full-time staff, the program will cost the state of Missouri about $3.5 million a year for each year the special prosecutor exists. That money could be spent on a number of proposals currently pending in this legislature, including teacher salaries. Instead, the money will be spent on a duplicate government office that won't have any more access to quality policing or court dockets than the current police prosecutor does. I chaired a task force, a corrections task force under Mayor Lyda Krewson. And we looked at why there was so many inmates in the detention center. We looked at why the bottleneck within the criminal justice system. And what we found was that a lot of different parties contributed to this bottleneck. The police contributed, the circuit attorney contributed, the judges contributed, the institution itself contributed. We believe very much, Mr. Chair, that this is in fact an attack on an African American elected official. Regardless of what people might say, the gentleman that's here, I don't doubt his heart, I don't doubt his conviction, but the reality is if you ask African Americans in this state, most African Americans in this state honestly believe that this is racially motivated, that it has racially, maybe not blatant attempts of racism, but it is racially insecure and it is racially insensitive, particularly in light of what we're dealing with right now in St. Louis.
To be clear, we're not here to defend or to demonize the Circuit Attorney of St. Louis. We're here instead to discuss this bill in front of this committee, which is not limited to the city of St. Louis. It's a bill that could impact every independently, locally elected prosecutor in the state of Missouri. The position of the Missouri Association of Prosecuting Attorneys is that House Bill 301 is both unnecessary and counterproductive. As we already know, Missouri law already provides a statutory mechanism to remove a prosecutor who neglects his or her duties. In fact, we know that because just this last week, the Missouri Attorney General has utilized that law. It goes by the Latin term of quo warranto. He filed a petition to remove the St. Louis Circuit Attorney from her position. That is the time-tested way to remove any local official, including a prosecutor, who fails to carry out the dictates of the law or uphold the will of the people who elected them. Quo warranto is found in Chapter 106 of our statutes. It allows any person, including in this instance an Attorney General, to file suit against any elected official, including a prosecutor, who neglects or willfully abandons the duties of their office. In this case, what's going to happen is a judge, after hearing all of the evidence, will determine whether or not the St. Louis Circuit Attorney has failed in her obligations and should be ousted. Should the evidence prove convincing, she will be immediately ousted from office and a newly appointed Circuit Attorney will take her position. Now, by way of contrast, House Bill 301 does not permit any immediate ouster of a prosecutor. Instead, only after the governor would act sometime on or after August 28th, and it would still leave the Circuit Attorney in place to prosecute the vast majority of crimes in that jurisdiction or a prosecutor in any other jurisdiction. So the existing remedy there in Chapter 106, which is being utilized even as we speak, provides the proper, effective, and tried and true remedy for any local official, including a prosecutor, to be removed should they fail to uphold the duties of their office. But my fear is this. House Bill 301 is not just unnecessary, we believe it also would be counterproductive. We've already mentioned that it would leave the offending prosecutor in place in any jurisdiction to prosecute the vast majority of crimes. Many assaults, all drug crimes, an overwhelming number of weapons offenses, all sexual offenses, all property crimes would continue to be handled solely by a prosecutor who, by definition, the governor had decided was incapable of successfully carrying out the duties of his or her office. House Bill 301 would actually leave the offending prosecutor in place to prosecute, or at their sole discretion not to prosecute, the vast majority of cases in a jurisdiction. That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, particularly when Chapter 106 already provides a mechanism to completely oust a prosecutor who is failing.
If your statistics include a guilty plea to a certain count but a dismissal of other counts, that's going to skew the numbers one direction. If you're talking about just cases by themselves that we file and there's a finding of guilt, I would I would venture to give you my educated guess, which would be in excess of 90%.
Ours would be in excess of 90% too. But again, I would caution this body that every jurisdiction is different. And you know, jury pools are different, judges are different in different places.
So would it surprise you to learn that Ms. Gardner's conviction rate between September 22nd and February, or September 2022 of last year and February 23rd of this year has been 50%?
Would that surprise me? It would not. But I would echo what Mr. Zahn says. Unfortunately, there are a lot of players in the city in terms of law enforcement, and each of those institutions bears some degree of responsibility, so it's hard to pinpoint just one office as being solely responsible for that, in my opinion.
And it's based on not the record, but based on what is broadcast in the media as a source of information. I did not expect that today. I would say this quickly. The chairman talked about kids with guns, and he mentioned in St. Louis, if you go to the Warren County record, on February the 3rd, they talked about 3 charged with giving a toddler a loaded gun. He was 1 year old. That was in Warren County. That's where the Attorney General stayed. It is amazing to hear the St. Charles County prosecutor talk about violent crimes and mandatory terms when last year a guy pled guilty to making 3 hand grenades, a Claymore mine, and 2 pipe bombs with the intent to blow up black people that came out to St. Charles protesting. And he got probation. But he talked about mandatory.
I'm going to ask members of the audience just to remain silent during witnesses' testimony so the committee can hear. Everybody's going to have an opportunity to come up and speak, but just for decorum purposes, please remain silent whenever testimony is happening.
He talked about mandatory for violent criminals. I don't know how much more violent you can get is to make bombs with the intent to blow up people. And the part that gets even stranger, we talked about back case logs. When Kim Gordon came into office, there were 32,000 cases under advisement waiting for her. 32,000. And we talked about 3,000 here, when out of that 3,000, the police department dumped 800 of those into the record in January, and included in those that they dumped in were 36 cases that was over a year old for resisting arrest and drugs. There was 116 that were 2 years old. There was tampering that was 2 years old, 34 cases. There were all sort of felony and dangerous cases that were years old that the police department just turned over to the prosecutor in January with an 800 file dump with the intent to influence this legislation and influence this committee. And nobody's investigating the police department about that. That is, I mean, those victims, nobody's doing anything about those victims that the police department sat on those cases for years.
Sir, I'm going to, so we have
Sure.
well over 2 minutes.
Sure, I would say this also. Statistics, overall felony rate for the prosecutor's office, 2015, 97%, 2016, 98%. This is Gordon getting in office. 2017, 97, 2016, 2019, 96. As relates to homicide rates, 86%. So I don't know, you get those numbers out the press, we get ours from the courts.
Sir, let me do this. Thank you for your testimony. I'm going to ask the witnesses or any of the senators if they have questions. If you have any statistics that you would like to be made available to the committee, if you could please leave that on top of the witness pile, we will make copies and make sure that gets distributed to members of the committee. Any questions for the witness?
And Mr. Chair, I just would like some latitude. I know that we're pushing up on time, but at the same time and respect we gave those in proponents of the bill, we want to give it to those in opposition.
We will be enforcing the same time limits on proponents of the bill as well.
I'll be brief. My name is Redden Hudson, the Office of St. Louis Circuit Attorney. I was here in January for the House hearing on HB 301, and at that time, I think it was the number of homicides that was referenced in the initial hearing as one of the primary drivers for the bill. the number of homicides under this circuit attorney. It was a baseless premise, as established at that hearing. For example, they're talking about that's new. But in 1982, 41 years ago, there were 226 homicides in St. Louis. 1981, 264 homicides in St. Louis. 1972, 205 homicides in St. Louis. 1971, 220. 1970, there were 266 homicides in St. Louis. It was pointed out that there could have been some population differences that could have skewed those numbers. So what we did then was zero in on a period of 5 years, 1991 to 1995, where the population is very much comparable to what we have now. During that 5-year period, there were 1,210 homicides in St. Louis. 1,210. There was no move by the state to replace then Circuit Attorney D. Joyce Hayes. There was no move to disenfranchise St. Louis voters. St. Louis was still vital to the region and the state at the time. And all of the many murders that happened during those years happened while the state had control of the police department. That's what state control gave us. I know because I was a police officer at the time. Daniel Roddy was out on bond because Judge Brian Bittenbach allowed him out on bond. Much has been made in the media of there being zero record. There's no record of any oral argument or any oral effort on the part of the Circuit Attorney's Office to address the bond issue. I spoke personally to the young lady who made the oral argument in front of Judge Bittenbach, but I know, sometimes word of mouth won't get it. So I brought documentation instead. Here's the court order from Judge.
Rather than reading the order to conserve time, why don't you give a copy of it?
He did it. I'll make a copy of it.
And we can distribute it to the members.
That's fine. But I do want to zero in on some language with the few seconds I have left. The court has received, this is the court order from the judge, the court has received multiple and repeated notices from pretrial release of GPS violations by the defendant. Lawyers have taught me that it is the judge who has the ability to revoke. He set a hearing on this date after it has been brought to his attention. Here's the ruling from the date that he had the hearing on the bond for Mr. Riley. The court has reviewed the bond, this is the court record, the ones that there's zero evidence of. Here it is physically, in reality. The court has reviewed the bond and leaves the defendant on GPS. Case is set for July 18, 2022. He left him out. Here's what I'll say, man. The fatal flaw, I just wanted to touch on those two things, but the fatal flaw in this legislation is that it disenfranchises voters in St. Louis, particularly black voters in St. Louis, who voted overwhelmingly for St. Louis Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner to do the work that she's doing. These attacks on her, Chris Hinckley came with me last time from the office. He's an attorney. I am not. He was able to effectively address some of the procedural issues that were raised. That's not my space. But this bill is an effort in no uncertain terms to disenfranchise voters in St. Louis, and in my personal opinion, to punish an independent black leader in the city of St. Louis who has delivered on her promise to address systemic issues in the system, demonstrated by holding powerful people accountable who have no expectation of being held accountable. I'm thinking about former Governor Greitens. I'm thinking about the two attorneys that flourished peaceful protesters as they walked down the streets of St. Louis, and she's being punished for it. Here we see Lamar Johnson, a man who was in prison for 28 years, now free through the efforts of this circuit attorney, because unlike prior circuit attorneys, she didn't go with the status quo. She actually looked at the facts of that case and recognized some of the police failures and prosecutorial failures that resulted in his loss of liberty. And now he's out, and I think that status quo defenders all over the state have responded thusly. So I'm sure that's my 3 minutes. I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you. First of all, I'm happy to hear that the circuit attorney is taking credit for the freeing of Lamar Johnson. Do you know whose legislation that was that resulted in him being free from prison?
I know she's the only circuit attorney that would have taken up that legislation.
It was my legislation.
But
It
didn't
was
she
my
have to
bill
create that
passed.
legislation because she was told that she didn't have standing to
She
take the
relied
case?
on private attorneys to litigate
Did
that
she
entire
not
case.
get told that she did not have the standing
She was
to take the case?
Yeah,
and that's why the
she was
legislation
told by the
was
Supreme Court, just like she was censured by the Supreme Court for unethical conduct as a prosecutor. She's been told a lot of things by the Supreme Court.
Yes, she has.
So,
But she's been voted into office by the people of St. Louis overwhelmingly with all of that information available.
so let me ask you this question. Why is the circuit attorney not here today?
You would have to ask the circuit attorney. I don't.
Well, no, I mean, it strikes me that this is a law that is addressing her systemic failures in the city of St. Louis. And yet, when there was a hearing on this legislation in the House,
What systemic failure?
she was a no-show. Whenever she saw the notice for this hearing that resulted in you coming down here, she didn't show up. My question is, why is the circuit attorney not here herself defending her record?
She's busy working for the people of St. Louis.
There you go.
So let me ask you, working for the people of the city of St. Louis, does that include having a 50% conviction rate for homicides?
That's not correct.
That's
I
not
don't think that's correct. I think the number is closer to 80%, but you would have to speak with somebody who directly works with those numbers. But I don't think that the percentage is correct. And I would say this, can I go on the record with this? I think we need to drill down and get the actual factual documentation of what that number is, because I think that's incorrect.
So the news media from multiple outlets,
The news media said it was no reason.
including multiple broadcast outlets in the city of St. Louis, including the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which is not exactly a conservative publication.
Which is not exactly a credible publication.
Let me ask you this. All of those media outlets are misrepresenting case numbers that they have from the circuit attorney's office they've analyzed.
No, all of those media outlets told me there was no record of this.
Right.
So what do you want me to do? Either they're credible or inconsistent. I don't know the answer to that, but I wouldn't rely only on what media outlets are telling you, especially when they consistently, over time, have shown a bias towards leadership in my city. You may not be from St. Louis, I am. So take my word on it, man. The media there, you don't always want to go hook, line, and single with what they put out to you.
The rights of the citizens of St. Louis obviously will not be respected if this law is allowed to be passed and implemented. That speaks to black people. We have to really unite and have a fight back to this legislation to strip our people of power that we have secured through their process, which is called voting, and it's supposed to be a democratic right. With them creating this bill, they effectively will take away the power of a elected official who was elected twice, and then the second time overwhelmingly with over nearly 69 to 70% of the vote. But that's, again, speaks to America. It speaks to the deep racism.
Missouri State Representative Michael Johnson. I'm the Vice Chair of the Missouri Legislative Black Caucus.
And my name is Yolanda Fonte Henderson. I'm a state representative in the 85th District, and I'm the Secretary of the Black Caucus.
Can you tell us what's going on with the Attorney General's bill?
Actually, it's not going anywhere, so as far as it having any momentum or anything, I think it was just really to add fuel to a fire from a different party that would like to see them not stay in office in their positions. But to me personally, it has no weight. It's not going anywhere.
Explain to me why it doesn't have any weight. Explain to the folks at home.
Well, once again, the senator is not from St. Louis City or from St. Louis County. There's zero evidence that Senator Eagles has any list of city voters requesting this action. So the city voters in St. Louis aren't even requesting this. The Senate President Pro Tem Khalid Rowden describes the idea as probably not the best one. Eagles was quoted saying, "I think that this is a primary goal is a statement setter, a statement maker." So it's just to make noise, knowing that it's not necessarily going anywhere. This indicates that they're aware that it's not viable and it's not a serious piece of legislation. So it's ultimately an attempt to get attraction for a campaign by politicizing a recent tragedy in a city that he does not live in.
it's a terrible accident. It's a terrible incident that happened to this young lady. You know, I hate to say, this is the same committee room that I filmed Mike Brown's mother in. You know, when she was testifying for body cameras. You know, we know about America's Most Wanted, John Wallace, when his son was, you know, abducted, kidnapped. You know, anything that happens to somebody that's our relative, we don't want that. Nobody wants this. You know, we want to get these people who only care about themselves and don't care about laws. We want to get them off the street, folks. You know, but it's just not one person that is their responsibility. It's not just the police. It's not the prosecutor's office. It's not just judges. It's you and me. You know, we all have to work together in this. And I ask myself, why aren't they just giving the circuit attorney's office help? You know, it seems, and I've heard this from other people, you got to remember that the Governor Parsons was in during Trump, and there were some altercations with the McCluskeys. There was some other stuff that Trump criticized Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner on, and Parsons just doubled down on it. You know, this is 3, 4, 5 years later, and we're still getting backlash from the governor's office. You would think that elected officials would be working together.